But there's a third father, and that third father basically is the hero. But the hero is the father that comes to embody the nation. You have to go through the fire. This is what the rites of initiation are all about. This is why men are tested in various capacities. They have to go through what is called the Crucible. We are regaining a sense of our power and our identity, which is hardening resistance and transforming us psychologically and otherwise into the rank and file of resistance. Welcome back to Men and the City. In today's video, we are going to talk about the three fathers and neo-masculinity. There was an interesting interview done between Andrew Huberman. Those of you who do not know, he's a neuroscientist and a fairly well-known podcaster at this point, and Sean Ryan, who has a fairly large podcast and following. The topic of this little snippet that I'm going to show highlights of in just a moment was about the crisis of masculinity, which is gaining increasing traction in the mainstream. I think most of you know.
One thing I'm increasingly concerned about, because it's the experience I know, I'm concerned about mental health for everybody, frankly, but I'm very concerned about the suicide rates and depression rates of young men in the United States and elsewhere. But we have a serious, serious crisis of identity that people are starting to talk about. But even the mere mention of it, it sounds like, oh no, they're all gonna rally together and do bad things. No, these young guys are so confused about whether or not they have any worth in the world or how to express their generative drive in positive ways. I think most of it starts with lack of, I'm just gonna say it, of a strong, in the right sense of the word, paternal figure.
But he leads off this quote, or highlights this snippet with a quote. It comes from a book called Iron John by a guy named Robert Bly. And the quote is as follows.
The whole of the remote father leaves a gap in the boy's life that demons can enter through.
Now, I think it's an interesting quote to be sure, but it leaves some doubt about the nature of fatherhood, of patriarchal authority and influence on young men, which is a subject that I have talked about at length on this channel. Huberman does a good job, I think, of diagnosing to some degree at a very surface level what's happening with men in the United States in particular, but I would broaden it to the Western world. But he doesn't really touch on the epicenter of the cause of this crisis of masculinity. Why are men committing suicide at record levels? Why are they succumbing to drug addiction? Why are they depressed? Why are they voluntarily leaving the workforce? Why are they unemployed? Why are they exiting from the sexual marketplace? What is this fatherhood issue all about? Well, as far as I can tell, there are three father figures, all of whom that sort of form a trinity of sorts that are essential for the boy to become a man. And a man that doesn't simply improve and act responsibly for himself, doesn't take care of his body and grow to be a productive member of society, but also a man that is committed to more than himself, maybe more than a family or a community, but towards what Robert Moore called a trans-egoic goal, something that's transcendent. Joseph Campbell said that there are two fathers. There is the biological father, that is the father that raises the child, that births the child, and shepherds him to adolescence. Then there is the mentor. The mentor is a surrogate father of sorts, a father figure that helps teach the man about power dynamics in the world, maybe guides him on a particular career path or teaches him a trade. But there's a third father, and that third father basically is the hero. But the hero is the father that comes to embody the nation. Without the nation as some kind of father figure, typically a king or a heroic symbol. Think of Achilles, for example, or some kind of mythical figure that comes to embody the virtues that all men should aspire to. Without these three fathers, men fall through the cracks and they succumb to self-destruction. However, there's something else that's really going on here. It's not simply about the absence of father figures in various iterations or manifestations. What men are going through today is an alchemical process. This is something I've written about before, so some of you are already familiar with my views on this. But what is alchemy, essentially? Alchemy is a science, sort of like chemistry, a more ancient form of it, that is about a permutation of metallic substance. So basically, it is the process by which you convert inferior metals to precious metals. So you go from platinum and palladium, for example, to silver and gold. But that is a metaphor for a spiritual process of transformation. In order to go through that process, you have to go through the fire. This is what the rites of initiation are all about. This is why men are tested in various capacities. They have to go through what is called the Crucible.
In New Guinea, there's a wonderful, wonderful event where this poor kid has to stand up and fight a man with a mask. I'd say he's fighting the god. The man lets the kid win, takes the mask off, puts it on the kid. Now, the mask is not there defeated and simply said, oh, this is just myth. He said the mask represents the power that is shaping the society and has shaped you, and now you are a representative of that power.
And a crucible, which is, even today, the final phase of basic training, depending on what branch of service you're in, it is the final test. Sea trials of sorts before you're ready to embark upon your transformation as a man to becoming an officer or a master welder or getting your Series 7. You know, there are various manifestations of this, to be sure. But a crucible, what does it mean? It is basically a receptacle that holds the compression of fire. Men are going through an alchemical process. We are burning through, purging, if you will, destructive ideas, poisonous ideas that have gotten control of our societies and despiritualized us. These are things like wokeism, communism, globalism, things of this ilk that have become institutionalized in the Western world. This is not new. But the alchemical process that men are going through is quite different than what Huberman describes. We are burning through all of this residual poison to get to this trans-egoic goal. What is that trans-egoic goal? It is a rebellion. It is a revolt. It is an uprising. It is a backlash against a corrupt and poisonous structure. It's what I call neo-masculinity. And this process, this alchemical transformation, is happening in the minds and in the souls of white men, because it is us who have suffered the brunt of this crisis of masculinity. Indeed, we are the villains. We are the targets.
And I think there's nothing when you look by race or by ideology that would particularly concern most people. It's pretty uniform, except for white liberals. And white liberals have a huge outgroup preference. They think other whites are dumber, more criminal, et cetera, et cetera. And this is really pathological. And maybe it's related to the fact that mental illness is also really, really high among this group of white liberals. But it's corrosive. And the people who think in this way, in this sort of self-hating way, should not be anywhere near power, in my view. And so I don't make any apology for going after them.
We are the subjects of this experimentation that's been in place more or less since the 1960s. Some would argue a bit earlier, some would argue a bit later. However you want to look at it, we have gone through this alchemical process. It's happening in the social economic sense. Men are being compressed economically. We're unemployed. We're being squeezed out of Fortune 500 companies and mainstream culture. It's happening in the socio-sexual marketplace. We are being spurned, marginalized, diminished by mainstream institutions, culture, which have gotten control of the female psyche and turned white women against white men. White men as the standard bearers of Western civilization have become the enemy, and therefore the undesirables, the villainized by the state, which, as we know, has been captured. It's happening at a political level. Left, right, whatever, ultimately is trying to empower specific privileged groups at the expense of white men, the designated enemy, the villains, as I said, the oppressors.
White people experience bias, prejudice, but the reason I did not step forward is because, by definition, racism is tied to power and economics. You talked about systemic discrimination. I don't feel white people experience racism by definition.
But in this process, men are sort of congealing. We are coagulating, we are gelling, as I've said before, in these online spaces, but those online spaces are just the beginning. These awareness machines that have been awakening men and shepherding us through this rite of initiation is beginning to mobilize politically, socially, culturally into nationalism. And nationalism is becoming the wellspring of that trans-egoic goal. Basically, men are realizing that our lives, specifically millennials and Gen Z, who've been completely dislodged from the legacy 9-to-5 trajectory. Go to college, get a degree, get a job, meet the girl, get the home, move to the suburbs, have the family. That trajectory is completely broken down. And so we have been left with nothing. But in nothing, we have gone through this alchemical process that Huberman, unwittingly or otherwise, is talking about, white men in particular. We are regaining a sense of our power and our identity, which is hardening resistance and transforming us psychologically and otherwise into the rank and file of resistance. This is what neo-masculinity is all about. And that is just beginning to fuel nationalist sentiment across the Western world. But we're not there yet. We're about to go through the final phase, the Crucible, and that is the breakdown of these legacy governments. It's the collapse of the Fifth Republic in France. It's the breakdown of constitutional authority in the United States. It is a categorical rejection of the corruption, the perversion of democracy in the Western world, which no longer represents the body politic, no longer represents men, has refuted the legacy hero stories that define these societies and indeed gave birth to democracy itself. So this is the direction, the trajectory that we're headed towards, and it's all centered in this alchemical process in young men. We are on the cusp, in other words, of a kind of metapolitical moment in which men that have been pushed to the margins and squeezed and crushed by this tyrannical power in its various iterations, a massive backlash, a reorganization, and a counter thrust is upon us. This is the purpose of masculinity today. This is what neo-masculinity is all about. The preceding years that we've experienced, the hardship that we have, being spurned in the sexual marketplace, being marginalized politically, being squeezed out economically and compressed, it's about to reverse with full force in 2025, and I suspect in the rest of the decade. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.